Don't scream. It's just an extra. My cousin Harold whispered to me that night when I was 15 years old. And I saw something that no girl should ever have to see. Something that would haunt me for the rest of my days and lock me in a prison made of silence and shame. My name is Callista Davis. I'm 79 years old now, and most folks around here know me as the quiet widow who tends her little garden and goes to church every Sunday morning without fail. But what they don't know, what nobody has ever known until this very moment, is the terrible secret I've been carrying in my heart for over 60 years about my cousin Harold and the 2 secrets he made me keep. Secrets that turned my whole life into a kind of prison where the bars were made of fear and the lock was forged from things too awful to speak aloud. I've sat with this burden for so long that sometimes I wonder if keeping it inside might just kill me before I get the chance to finally let it out. And I reckon that's why I'm here talking to you now, because some stories are too heavy for one old woman to carry to her grave. You see, there comes a time in every woman's life when she realizes that the truth, no matter how ugly or how painful, needs to see the light of day. And maybe if I can find the courage to tell you what really happened in that little house on Elm Street all those years ago, maybe some other girl somewhere won't have to suffer the way I did, won't have to spend her whole life wondering if what happened to her was somehow her fault. So if you're willing to sit with me a while and listen to an old woman's confession, if you can bear to hear about the kind of family secrets that small towns like to bury deep and never speak of again, then stay with me through this story, because it's going to get darker before it gets lighter. But I promise you this, by the time I'm done, you'll understand that even in the deepest darkness, even when you think there's no way out, the human heart can find a way to survive. And sometimes that survival is its own kind of victory. You know, when I think back to 1961, to that summer when everything changed, I can still smell the honeysuckle that grew wild along our fence line and hear the way the screen door would slam shut behind my mama when she'd call us in for supper. Corbin, Kentucky wasn't much more than a handful of streets and a railroad track back then. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, or at least they thought they did. I was the 7th of 8 children, quiet as a church mouse most times, the kind of girl who'd rather sit in the corner with a book than cause any kind of fuss. And maybe that's why nobody paid much attention when Harold started coming around more often than usual. Harold was my daddy's second cousin, a man of 43, who'd made something of himself in the funeral business. And when he'd drive up in that big black Cadillac of his, all the neighbors would peek through their curtains and whisper about how successful he'd become. He owned the only funeral parlor in 3 counties, lived in that grand Victorian house that sat right next to his business, like a shadow, and everybody in town treated him with the kind of respect you give to a preacher or a doctor. My mama would flutter around him like a moth to a flame whenever he visited, fixing him the best pieces of chicken and making sure his sweet tea glass never went empty, because Harold represented something of our poor family had never had: respectability and money. But there was something about Harold that made my skin crawl, something in the way his pale gray eyes would follow me when he thought nobody was looking, the way his fingers would linger just a little too long when he'd pat my shoulder and tell me what a pretty young lady I was becoming. I'd catch him staring at me during Sunday dinners, and when I'd look back he'd smile that thin, cold smile of his and turn his attention back to whatever grown-up conversation was happening around the table. My sisters never seemed to notice, and my mama was too busy being impressed by his fancy manners and his expensive clothes to pay attention to the way he made me feel like a bug under a magnifying glass. The first time I understood that something wasn't right with Harold, I was helping Mama with the dishes after one of his visits, and I heard her talking to Daddy about how Harold had mentioned needing a wife to help him maintain his standing in the community. She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like wives were something you could just order from a catalog. And when Daddy asked who Harold had in mind, Mama got that look on her face that meant she was scheming about something. I pretended to be scrubbing the same plate over and over, but I was listening to every word, and when I heard Mama say my name, my blood went cold as winter water. They talked about it like I wasn't even a person, like I was just another mouth to feed that they could pass along to someone who could afford to take care of me. Mama kept going on about what a good opportunity it would be, how Harold could give me a life of comfort and security, how I'd never want for anything as long as I lived. Daddy wasn't so sure at first. He kept saying I was still just a child, but Mama had already made up her mind. And when Mama set her heart on something, there wasn't much anybody could do to change it. The worst part wasn't even that they were planning to marry me off to a man nearly 3 times my age. The worst part was realizing that they saw it as doing me a favor, like they were rescuing me from a life of poverty and struggle by handing me over to Harold like I was some kind of prize cow at the county fair. I stood there at that kitchen sink with my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold on to the dish towel. And I felt something die inside me that I didn't even know I had. Maybe it was trust, or maybe it was just the last little bit of childhood I'd been clinging to. And that was when I first understood that families aren't always the safe harbor they're supposed to be. That sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones who'll trade your happiness for their own peace of mind, and that some prisons are built with good intentions and locked with love that isn't really love at all. The wedding was set for the fall of 1961, just 2 months after my 16th birthday, and I remember thinking that 16 felt both too young and too old at the same time. Too young to be getting married to anyone, but too old to still be hoping that somebody might save me from what was coming. The whole town seemed to buzz with excitement about the match, like it was some kind of fairy tale instead of what it really was. And everywhere I went, ladies would stop me on the street to tell me how lucky I was, how Harold was such a catch, how I'd be living in the finest house in 3 counties. Harold started coming by every Sunday after church, sitting on our front porch with Daddy and talking about business, while Mama fussed over him like he was visiting royalty. He'd always bring me little gifts, a hair ribbon from the general store, a small bottle of cologne that smelled too sweet and made my head ache, a book of poetry that I was too nervous to read because his pale eyes would watch me whenever I held it. The gifts felt more like chains than kindnesses, each one a reminder of what I owed him, what I was being traded for. And I'd smile and say, "Thank you," because that's what good girls were supposed to do, even when their stomachs were twisted up in knots. But it was the way Harold looked at me that made my skin crawl most of all. Like he was studying me the same way he might study one of the bodies that came through his funeral parlor, with that cold, clinical interest that had nothing warm or loving about it. When he'd take my hand to help me down from the porch steps, his fingers felt like ice even in the middle of summer, and they'd linger on my skin just long enough to make me want to scrub my hands raw afterward. He never tried to kiss me or hold me close the way I'd seen other young couples do. Instead, he'd just watch me with those gray eyes of his, like he was cataloging every detail about me, for some purpose I couldn't understand. The strangest thing about Harold, though, was the way he talked about his work, about the funeral business and what he called the sacred duty of caring for the departed. Most folks in our town tried not to think too much about death and dying, but Harold spoke about it like other men might talk about farming or fishing, with a kind of enthusiasm that made me uncomfortable. He'd tell stories about the families he'd helped through their grief, about the beautiful services he'd arranged, about how peaceful the deceased looked after he'd finished preparing them. And there was something in his voice when he talked about those dead bodies that made me feel sick to my stomach. One Sunday afternoon, When Mama had gone inside to fix us all some lemonade, Harold leaned closer to me on the porch swing and started telling me about the house where we'd live after we were married, about how quiet and peaceful it was, how the rooms were always cool even in the hottest weather because of all the marble and stone. He described the bedroom where I'd sleep, with its high ceiling and heavy curtains that blocked out all the light, and the way he talked about it made it sound less like a home and more like a tomb. When I shivered despite the warm afternoon, he smiled that thin smile of his and said, I'd get used to the chill, that some things just took time to feel natural. That was the first moment I truly understood that Harold wasn't just strange. There was something fundamentally wrong with him, something broken or missing that made him different from other people. The way he talked about death and bodies and quiet, cold rooms wasn't the way normal folks talked about such things. And when I looked into his eyes while he described our future together, I saw something that scared me more than I could put into words. It was like looking into a well and seeing nothing but darkness at the bottom. No reflection, no light, just an empty space where warmth and kindness should have been. But I was just a 16-year-old girl in a small Kentucky town in 1961, and nobody was asking what I thought about any of it. Nobody was wondering if maybe I might have some opinion about who I wanted to spend my life with, or what kind of future I dreamed of for myself. I was just expected to smile and be grateful and trust that the grown-ups knew what was best for me, even when every instinct I had was screaming that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. And that night, after Harold had driven away in his big black car and the family had all gone to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering if there was any way out of the trap that was closing around me, not knowing that the worst part wasn't the trap itself, but what I was about to discover was waiting for me inside it. The wedding ceremony was held on a gray October morning in 1961, with the leaves already turned brown and falling like dead things all around the little Baptist church, where I'd been baptized just 3 years before. I wore my mama's old wedding dress, taken in and hemmed to fit my small frame, and when I looked at myself in the cracked mirror in the church's back room, I barely recognized the pale, hollow-eyed girl staring back at me. The dress felt like a costume for a play I didn't want to be in, and when Reverend Matthews asked if I took Harold to be my husband, my voice came out so quiet that he had to ask me to speak up, like even my own body was trying to keep me from saying those words. Harold's house, my new home, sat like a great stone monument next to his funeral parlor, all dark wood and heavy curtains that seemed to swallow up what little sunlight managed to find its way through the tall oak trees that surrounded the property. The inside smelled like lilies and something else, something sharp and chemical that made my nose burn and my eyes water. And when I asked Harold about it, he just smiled that thin smile of his and told me I'd get used to it, the same way he told me I'd get used to everything else about my new life. The first few weeks passed in a strange, dreamlike blur of trying to learn how to be a wife, when I still felt like a child playing dress-up in someone else's life. Harold would leave early each morning to tend to his business downstairs, and I'd spend my days wandering through the big, silent rooms of the house, touching the heavy furniture and thick carpet with my fingertips, trying to make sense of this new world I'd been dropped into like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. The house was beautiful in its way, filled with fine things that must have cost more money than my family saw in a whole year. But there was something cold and lifeless about it all, like living inside a museum where you weren't allowed to touch anything or make any noise. But it was the nights that truly showed me the depth of what I'd gotten myself into. Or rather, what I'd been sold into. On our wedding night, in that big bedroom with its heavy curtains drawn tight against the world outside, Harold sat me down on the edge of the bed and told me there were things about him that I needed to understand, things that made him different from other men. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather or what we might have for breakfast. And that casual tone somehow made what he was about to show me even more terrifying than if he'd been angry or desperate or ashamed. When Harold began to undress, removing his clothes with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else in his life, I tried to look away, tried to give him the privacy that seemed proper for a husband and wife, but he told me to watch, told me it was important that I see and understand exactly what kind of man I'd married. And there was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't a request, but a command. And when he revealed himself to me fully, when I saw the thing that made him different from every other man on earth, I understood for the first time why he'd needed a wife who was young and naive and had no choice but to keep his secrets. Harold had been born with a condition that the doctors probably had some fancy Latin name for. But all I knew was that where other men had one thing, he had two, and the sight of it made my stomach lurch and my head spin like I was going to faint right there on the bedroom floor. It wasn't just the physical shock of it, though that was bad enough. It was the way Harold watched my reaction with those cold gray eyes of his, studying my face like he was taking notes on my horror and disgust, cataloging my revulsion the same way he might catalog the condition of a body that came through his funeral parlor. He explained to me then, in that same calm, clinical voice, that this was why he'd needed to marry someone young, someone who didn't know enough about men to understand what was normal and what wasn't, someone who could be trained to accept what others might find repulsive or frightening. He told me that his condition was our secret now, something that bound us together in a way that was stronger than any marriage vows. Because if I ever told anyone about what I'd seen, if I ever tried to leave him or betray his trust, he'd make sure that everyone in town knew exactly what kind of girl I really was, what kind of things I'd been willing to do to live in his fine house and wear his expensive gifts. That was the moment I realized that my marriage wasn't a new beginning, but an ending, the closing of a door that would never open again, and that the prison I'd sensed closing around me was even smaller and darker than I'd imagined. I wasn't just Harold's wife. I was his secret keeper, his accomplice in hiding the truth about what he was. And the weight of that knowledge settled on my shoulders like a stone that would never stop pressing down on me, no matter how many years passed or how far I might try to run. And as I lay there in that big cold bed on my wedding night, listening to Harold's steady breathing beside me and feeling like I might suffocate on the silence and the smell of lilies and chemicals, I began to understand that some secrets are so heavy they can bury you alive, and that sometimes the only difference between a marriage and a grave is how deep they dig the hole. Living in that house was like being buried alive in a tomb, made of fine things and suffocating silence, where every room held the smell of death and chemicals that seemed to seep up through the floorboards from the funeral parlor below. Harold would disappear into his work each morning before the sun came up, leaving me alone with nothing but the ticking of grandfather clocks and the whisper of my own footsteps on thick carpets that muffled every sound until I sometimes wondered if I was losing my hearing along with everything else that had once made me feel human. The days stretched out like years, each one identical to the last, and I found myself moving through the house like a ghost, haunting rooms that had never really belonged to me in the first place. Harold had made it clear from our wedding night that I was expected to keep house and keep quiet, to be available when he needed me and invisible when he didn't. And the weight of that expectation pressed down on me until I felt like I was shrinking into myself, becoming smaller and smaller until maybe one day I'd just disappear entirely. But it was the nights that truly broke something inside me. Those long, dark hours when Harold would come upstairs from his work with that chemical smell clinging to his clothes and that empty look in his gray eyes that told me he'd been touching dead bodies all day. and found more comfort in their silence than he ever would in anything living. He never hurt me. Not in the way that some men hurt their wives. But there was something worse than violence in the way he used me. Something cold and mechanical that made me feel like just another body he was preparing, positioning, arranging according to his needs. The first time I tried to resist him, tried to turn away when he reached for me with those ice-cold hands of his, Harold simply held my chin between his fingers and reminded me of our agreement, of the secret I was now bound to keep, and what would happen to me if I ever forgot my place in his world. He reminded me that I had nowhere to go, no family who would take me back after what they'd consider a scandal, no skills or education that would let me survive on my own in a world that had no patience for women who couldn't keep their husbands satisfied. The worst part was realizing he was right, that I truly was trapped in this cold, beautiful house with this strange, broken man who treated me like an object he'd purchased rather than a person he'd married. My mama had written me exactly one letter after the wedding, full of chatter about how proud she was of the match she'd made, and how she hoped I was grateful for the opportunity Harold had given me to better myself. And when I tried to write back about how lonely I was, how frightened I felt, how wrong everything seemed, I found that the words wouldn't come out right on the paper. Like my hand refused to betray Harold's secrets, even when my heart was breaking from carrying them. It was around Christmas of that first year when I discovered Harold's second secret, the one that made his physical abnormality seem almost innocent by comparison. I'd been looking for extra blankets in the basement storage room, trying to find something to keep me warm in that perpetually cold house, when I noticed a door I'd never seen before, tucked away behind a stack of old funeral equipment and covered with dust, like it hadn't been opened in years. The door was locked, but the key was hanging right there on a nail beside the frame, and something about that carelessness made me curious in a way I hadn't been curious about anything since my wedding day. When I turned that key and pushed open the door, when I stepped into that small windowless room and saw what Harold had been hiding down there in the darkness, I felt something snap inside my chest, like a branch breaking under too much weight. The room was lined with shelves, and on every shelf were glass jars filled with clear liquid, and floating in that liquid were things that shouldn't exist, things that made my stomach heave and my knees buckle, until I had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. They were parts of bodies, pieces that Harold had been cutting away and keeping for reasons I couldn't understand, and didn't want to understand, and some of them looked fresh, while others had been there so long they'd turned gray and strange in their chemical baths. But it was the notebooks that made everything clear, the careful records Harold had been keeping of every body that passed through his funeral parlor, with detailed notes about which parts he'd taken and why, like he was conducting some kind of scientific study using the dead people that grieving families had entrusted to his care. Page after page of his neat handwriting, describing the condition of organs, the texture of skin, the way certain body parts had changed color or consistency after being preserved in his jars. And I realized that Harold wasn't just a funeral director. He was something else entirely, something that had found the perfect job to feed whatever dark hunger lived inside him. Standing there in that awful room, surrounded by the evidence of Harold's true nature, I finally understood why he'd needed a wife who was young and frightened, and had no choice but to keep his secrets, because what he was doing down there in the basement wasn't just strange or disturbing. It was the kind of thing that would get him run out of town or worse if anyone ever found out. And I was the only person alive who knew the truth about the man the whole community trusted with their most precious and vulnerable moments. And as I carefully locked that door and crept back upstairs to the cold, empty rooms where I was supposed to pretend to be happy, I knew that my prison had just gotten smaller and darker than I'd ever imagined possible, because now I wasn't just keeping Harold's physical secret. I was keeping the secret of what he really was, and that weight was going to crush me if I didn't find some way to escape before it was too late. The winter of 1962 was the coldest anyone in Corbin could remember, and that big old house seemed to trap the chill in its bones, like it was holding on to every frozen breath that had ever been exhaled within its walls. I spent most of my days huddled near the radiators, wrapped in shawls and blankets. But no amount of wool could warm the ice that had settled in my chest after discovering Harold's collection in the basement. Every time I looked at him across the dinner table, every time he touched my hand or spoke my name, I saw those terrible jars floating behind my eyes and wondered how many families in our town had buried their loved ones, missing pieces they'd never know were gone. Harold seemed different after the holidays, more distant and preoccupied than usual, spending longer hours downstairs in the funeral parlor and coming to bed so late that I'd sometimes wake up in the morning and find his side of the bed cold and empty, like he'd never come upstairs at all. At first I was grateful for the space, grateful for any time when I didn't have to feel those gray eyes studying me or endure the touch of his ice-cold hands. But after a while I began to wonder what was keeping him so busy down there, in the dark. What new horrors he might be adding to his collection while I lay alone in that big, silent bedroom. It was Mrs. Fletcher from the general store who first mentioned the missing things, standing in line at the post office one February morning when the snow was falling so thick you could barely see across the street. She was telling anyone who'd listen about how her mother's wedding ring had gone missing from the body before the funeral, how she'd specifically asked Harold to make sure Mama was buried, wearing it because Daddy had slipped it on her finger the day before he died, and now it was just gone like it had never existed at all. I felt my stomach drop like a stone thrown down a well, but I kept my face perfectly still and made sympathetic noises about how upset Mrs. Fletcher must be, how sometimes these things just got misplaced in all the preparations for a funeral. But inside, my heart was beating so hard, I was sure everyone in the post office could hear it, because I knew exactly where that ring had gone. Knew it was probably sitting in one of Harold's glass jars down in that awful room, floating in chemical solution, like some kind of trophy. More stories started surfacing as the winter wore on. Little whispered complaints about missing jewelry or family heirlooms that should have been buried with the deceased, but had somehow vanished between the time the body arrived at Harold's funeral parlor and the time it was laid to rest. Most folks chalked it up to grief-stricken relatives forgetting what they'd actually sent along with their loved ones, or maybe someone in the family quietly removing valuable items before the burial. But I knew the truth was much darker and more twisted than anyone in our little town could imagine. The worst part was watching Harold at church on Sunday mornings, sitting in the front pew like the pillar of the community everyone believed him to be, nodding solemnly when Reverend Matthew spoke about honoring the dead and treating our departed loved ones with dignity and respect. Harold would even contribute extra money to the church collection plate, making a show of his generosity while I sat beside him, knowing that his hands had been touching corpses and stealing from the dead just hours before he'd touched the pages of his hymnal. I started having nightmares around that time, terrible dreams where I'd find myself trapped in that basement room, surrounded by hundreds of glass jars, each one containing pieces of people I'd known and loved, and Harold would be there with his calm, clinical voice, explaining to me how each specimen had been obtained and preserved. I'd wake up gasping and covered in cold sweat, but when I'd reach over to Harold's side of the bed for some kind of comfort, I'd find him gone again, disappeared into the bowels of the house to pursue whatever dark work kept him busy through the long winter nights. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a new development that would change everything about my situation and force me to confront the true depths of Harold's depravity. A traveling salesman had died in a car accident just outside of town, a young man with no family nearby, and no one to ask questions about his belongings or make sure he was being treated with proper dignity. Harold took charge of the arrangements, as he always did with unclaimed bodies, and I watched him prepare for this particular funeral with an intensity and excitement that made my skin crawl. The night before the stranger's burial, I couldn't sleep, for wondering what Harold might be doing downstairs, what pieces of this poor man might end up in those terrible jars, what violations were being committed in the name of funeral preparation. So I crept down the stairs in my bare feet, moving as quietly as I could through the dark house, until I reached the door that led to Harold's workroom. And when I pressed my ear against the wood, I heard sounds that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Harold was talking to someone down there, carrying on a conversation in that same calm, measured tone he used for everything else. But when I strained to listen closer, I realized there was no other voice responding to his words, no second person in that room with him. He was talking to the body on his preparation table, speaking to the dead man like he was an old friend, describing what he was doing as he worked, and asking questions that would never be answered. And that was when I understood that Harold's sickness went deeper than just stealing from the dead or keeping trophies in glass jars, that there was something fundamentally broken in his mind that made him see corpses not as people who deserved respect and dignity, but as companions who would never judge him or leave him or tell his secrets to the world. By the summer of 1962, I'd learned to move through that house like a shadow, keeping my footsteps light and my breathing quiet, because I discovered that Harold had ears like a hawk and eyes that seemed to see everything, even when he appeared to be focused on his work downstairs. The heat that year was oppressive, the kind that made your clothes stick to your skin and turned the air thick as molasses. But inside Harold's house it stayed cool as a tomb, and I began to understand that the chill wasn't just from the stone and marble. It was something that came from Harold himself, something that sucked the warmth out of everything around him. I'd started keeping a journal that summer, hiding it under a loose floorboard in the bedroom closet where Harold would never think to look, and writing down everything I observed about his strange behaviors and increasingly disturbing habits. I told myself it was just a way to keep track of time, to have something that belonged to me in a house where everything else was his. But deep down I knew I was documenting evidence of something terrible, creating a record that might someday help people understand what had really been happening in that funeral parlor all those years. The missing items from bodies had become more frequent and more obvious, to the point where even the most trusting families were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about their loved ones' jewelry and personal effects. Harold handled these inquiries with his usual calm professionalism, expressing deep concern and promising to look into each case personally. But I could see something changing in his demeanor, a tension around his eyes and mouth that suggested he was feeling the pressure of keeping his secrets hidden from an increasingly suspicious community. It was during one of those sweltering July nights, when I couldn't sleep for the heat and the weight of everything I knew, that I made a discovery that changed my understanding of Harold's sickness in ways I hadn't thought possible. I'd been lying in bed listening to him move around downstairs, hearing the familiar sounds of his late-night activities in the preparation room, when I realized that the sounds were different somehow, more varied and complex than the usual routine of his work. Driven by a curiosity that I knew was dangerous, but couldn't seem to resist, I crept down the stairs and positioned myself outside the workroom door, pressing my ear against the wood the way I'd done before. But this time, what I heard made my stomach lurch and my knees nearly buckle with horror, because Harold wasn't just talking to the bodies anymore. He was singing to them, soft lullabies and hymns in that same calm, measured voice, like he was trying to comfort them or put them to sleep. The singing was disturbing enough, but what came next was worse. I could hear Harold moving around the room, his footsteps circling the preparation table. And then there were other sounds, the scrape of metal instruments, the splash of liquids being poured, the wet sounds of things being cut or separated. And through it all, Harold kept up a running commentary, describing what he was doing in loving detail, praising the beauty of what he was finding, expressing gratitude to his silent companions for allowing him to explore their secrets. I stood there in the darkness outside that door for what felt like hours, frozen by a combination of horror and fascination, listening to Harold perform his grotesque rituals on the bodies that had been entrusted to his care. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to understand that what I'd discovered in those glass jars was just the beginning of Harold's obsession with the dead, that his true sickness went far deeper than simple theft or morbid curiosity. Harold wasn't just taking trophies from the bodies. He was conducting some kind of twisted experiments on them, cutting them open and rearranging their parts, preserving pieces in ways that went far beyond what was necessary for normal funeral preparation. He spoke about their organs and tissues like an artist might describe his materials, with reverence and passion and a kind of love that made my skin crawl, because it was so completely wrong, so fundamentally perverted from what love was supposed to be. But the most chilling moment came near the end of that awful night, when I heard Harold's voice change from that clinical, professional tone to something softer and more intimate, and I realized he was no longer speaking to the body as a funeral director to a client. He was speaking to it as if it were alive, as if it could hear and understand him, asking it questions about what it felt like to be so still and peaceful, wondering aloud if it was happy to be free from all the pain and struggle of living. And that was when I understood that Harold's obsession with the dead wasn't just about satisfying some sick curiosity or collecting gruesome trophies. It was about finding the kind of perfect silent companionship that living people could never provide him. The dead couldn't judge him or reject him or leave him alone. They couldn't tell his secrets or demand explanations for his behavior. They were completely under his control, completely dependent on his care, and in their silence and stillness, he'd found the only kind of relationship he was capable of maintaining. Standing there in the hallway outside that door, listening to my husband carry on his one-sided conversations with corpses, I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal properly, no matter how many years passed or how far I might eventually run from that house. I wasn't just married to a man who stole from the dead. I was married to someone who preferred their company to that of the living, someone who found more comfort in a corpse than he'd ever found in his own wife. And as I crept back upstairs to that cold, empty bedroom, moving as quietly as a ghost through a house that felt more like a mausoleum with each passing day, I knew that I had to find a way out before Harold's sickness consumed what little sanity I had left. Because some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry, and some truths are too terrible to live with alone. The autumn of 1962 brought with it a restlessness in Harold that I'd never seen before, a kind of nervous energy that made him pace the halls of our house at all hours and spend even longer periods downstairs in his workroom, emerging only for meals that he'd eat in complete silence while staring at something I couldn't see. The town had been unusually busy with deaths that fall. An early flu outbreak had taken several of the older residents, and there'd been 2 car accidents on the winding mountain roads that brought young bodies to Harold's table, bodies that seemed to fascinate him in ways that made my stomach turn. I'd been watching him more carefully since that horrible night when I'd listened to him singing to the corpses, and what I observed during those gray October days convinced me that Harold's madness was growing stronger, feeding on itself like a fire that gets bigger the more fuel you give it. He'd started talking to himself even when he wasn't in the workroom, muttering conversations under his breath while he ate his breakfast or read the newspaper. And sometimes I'd catch him smiling at nothing, his thin lips curving upward, while his gray eyes stared at empty air. But it was the way he looked at me that truly frightened me during those weeks, studying my face and body with the same clinical interest he'd once reserved for his corpses, like he was cataloging my features and taking mental notes about my condition. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and there'd be something hungry in his expression, something calculating and cold, that made me feel like prey being examined by a predator who was planning when and how to strike. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night in late October, when the wind was howling through the bare tree branches and rattling the windows of that old house like skeleton fingers trying to get inside. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of walking on eggshells around Harold's increasingly strange behavior. But I was awakened sometime after midnight by sounds coming from downstairs that were unlike anything I'd heard before. Not the usual methodical sounds of funeral preparation, but something chaotic and frantic, like someone was searching desperately for something they'd lost. I crept down the stairs in my nightgown, my bare feet silent on the thick carpet, and followed the sounds to Harold's workroom, where light was spilling out from under the door in bright, harsh rectangles that hurt my eyes after the darkness of the hallway. But when I pressed my ear to the door to listen, what I heard made my blood freeze in my veins, and my heart nearly stopped beating altogether, because Harold wasn't alone in that room. There was someone else with him, someone who was making sounds that no living person should ever have to make. The voice was weak and muffled, like someone trying to speak through cloth or liquid, and it was begging Harold to stop, pleading with him in broken, gasping words that came out wrong, like the person's mouth wasn't working properly. But Harold's voice was calm and soothing, the same tone he used when he was working on his regular corpses, explaining to this living person what he was going to do, describing the process in loving detail, while those awful, desperate sounds continued to come from his victim. I stood there in that hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, paralyzed by the realization that Harold had finally crossed the line from violating the dead to creating them, that he'd brought someone into his workroom who was still breathing, still conscious, still capable of feeling pain and terror. The sounds that came through that door were the sounds of someone dying slowly and horribly, and Harold's voice continued throughout it all, gentle and clinical, and completely without mercy. When the sounds finally stopped, when that terrible pleading voice went quiet forever, I heard Harold moving around the room with his usual efficiency, and I knew he was beginning the process of transforming his latest victim into just another body for the county morgue. Another unexplained death in a small town where people trusted their funeral director to handle such matters with dignity and discretion. I made it back to the bedroom somehow, my legs shaking so badly I could barely climb the stairs, and I spent the rest of that night huddled under the covers, trying not to think about what I'd heard, trying not to imagine who that person might have been, or how Harold had gotten them into his workroom without anyone noticing. But I couldn't stop my mind from racing through the possibilities, couldn't stop wondering if this was the first time Harold had killed someone, or if there had been other victims, other unexplained deaths, that the whole town had simply accepted as tragic but natural occurrences. The next morning Harold appeared at the breakfast table looking refreshed and satisfied, like he'd slept better than he had in months. And when he spoke to me about the weather and the grocery list, his voice was lighter and more cheerful than I'd heard it sound in ages. He even smiled at me across the table, a real smile that reached his eyes for once. And I realized with dawning horror that whatever he'd done the night before had given him some kind of peace or fulfillment that he'd been desperately craving. 3 days later, the body of a traveling salesman was discovered in his car on a back road outside of town, apparently the victim of a heart attack or some other sudden medical emergency. The county sheriff brought the body to Harold's funeral parlor, as he always did with unexplained deaths, and Harold handled the arrangements with his usual professional competence, expressing sympathy for the man's distant relatives and ensuring that he received a proper burial, despite having no local connections. But I knew the truth about that salesman, knew that he hadn't died of natural causes in his car, but had died slowly and terribly in Harold's workroom while I stood outside the door, listening to his final moments. And as I watched my husband conduct that funeral service, speaking solemnly about the mystery of life and death while the whole community nodded along with his words, I understood that I was living with a monster who had found the perfect cover for his crimes, a respected member of the community who could kill people and then be praised for the dignity with which he laid them to rest. And sitting in that church pew, listening to Harold's eulogy for a man he'd murdered, I knew that I had reached the point where silence was no longer just complicity, but active participation in evil, and that if I didn't find the courage to act soon, there would be more victims, more innocent people who would die horrible deaths to satisfy Harold's twisted hunger for the perfect, silent companionship that only corpses could provide. The winter that followed was the longest of my life, every day stretching out like a year as I tried to figure out what to do with the terrible knowledge that was eating me alive from the inside. I'd started jumping at every sound, flinching whenever Harold touched me, and lying awake at night listening for those awful sounds from the workroom that might tell me he'd found another victim. The weight of keeping his secrets was crushing me, but the weight of what might happen if I broke that silence seemed even heavier, because who would believe such a story about the most respected man in 3 counties? I tried writing letters to my family back home, but every time I put pen to paper, the words came out sounding crazy, even to me. How do you tell someone that your husband talks to corpses and steals from the dead and murders innocent people in his basement? How do you explain that the man everyone admires as a pillar of the community is actually a monster who finds more comfort in the company of the dead than the living? I'd write paragraph after paragraph, trying to find some way to make the truth sound believable. But I'd always end up burning the letters in the fireplace because I knew they'd just think I was having some kind of nervous breakdown. Harold seemed to sense my growing desperation during those dark months, watching me with those cold gray eyes of his whenever he thought I wasn't paying attention. And I began to wonder if he was planning something for me, if I was going to become another unexplained death that he'd handle with his usual professional competence. Sometimes I'd catch him studying my face and body with that clinical interest that meant he was thinking about me the same way he thought about the corpses on his table, and I'd have to excuse myself to go be sick in the bathroom, because the implications of that look were too horrible to contemplate. But it was a conversation I overheard between Harold and Sheriff Morrison that finally pushed me toward action. A casual discussion about a missing person case that had been bothering the sheriff for months. A young woman from Louisville had disappeared while traveling through our area the previous summer, and her family had been asking questions, wondering if anyone in our county had seen or heard anything that might explain what had happened to her. Harold expressed sympathy for the family's situation and offered to help in any way he could. But I heard something in his voice when he spoke about the missing woman, a kind of satisfaction that made my skin crawl, because I was beginning to recognize the tone he got when he was thinking about his victims. And that night, when I crept down to listen, outside his workroom door, I heard him talking to one of his preserved specimens about a pretty young lady who'd been so surprised when he'd offered to help her with her car trouble. So grateful right up until the moment she'd realized what was really happening to her. That was when I understood that the traveling salesman hadn't been Harold's first murder, that there had been others, innocent people who'd had the misfortune to cross paths with a monster who looked like a respectable businessman. And I realized that my silence wasn't just protecting Harold's reputation. It was enabling him to keep killing, giving him the cover he needed to continue his horrible work, while the community remained completely unaware of what was happening. Right under their noses. The decision to act came to me not in a moment of courage, but in a moment of exhaustion, when I was so tired of carrying Harold's secrets that I felt like they might kill me if I kept them inside much longer. I couldn't go to the sheriff. Harold and Sheriff Morrison were too close, played poker together every Thursday night, and I knew Morrison would never believe such accusations against his friend. I couldn't write to my family or try to run away, because Harold had made it clear that he'd find me wherever I went and make me pay for betraying his trust. But there was one option I hadn't considered. One person who might listen to what I had to say, without immediately dismissing me as a hysterical woman making wild accusations. Dr. Patterson had been practicing medicine in our county for over 30 years, had delivered half the babies in town, and seen more death than anyone except Harold himself. And I'd heard him speak at church about the importance of bearing witness to truth, even when that truth was difficult or dangerous. So, on a cold February morning, when Harold had driven to the next county to pick up a body, I walked to Dr. Patterson's office and asked to speak with him privately about a matter of life and death. I didn't tell him everything. I wasn't that brave yet, but I told him enough about Harold's strange behavior and the missing items from bodies to plant seeds of suspicion in his mind, to give him reasons to start asking questions that might eventually lead to the truth. Dr. Patterson listened to me with the kind of serious attention that I hadn't received from another human being since my wedding day. And when I finished speaking, he didn't dismiss my concerns or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he asked careful questions about specific incidents, took notes about dates and details, and promised to look into the matters I'd raised without mentioning my name or putting me in any danger. Walking home from that meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the prison Harold had built around me. I didn't know what Dr. Patterson would discover or how long it might take, but for the first time since my wedding night, I allowed myself to imagine a future where Harold's secrets were no longer mine to keep, where the weight of his crimes was no longer crushing my soul into dust. But as I approached that big cold house where Harold was waiting for me, as I saw the light burning in his workroom window and knew he was down there with another body, performing his twisted rituals on someone who deserved better than to be touched by his diseased hands, I also knew that the most dangerous part of my journey was just beginning, because secrets like Harold's don't die easily, and the monsters who keep them will do anything to protect the darkness they've built their lives around. Spring came early to Corbin that year, and with it came a kind of restless energy that seemed to infect everyone in town. Like the warming air was stirring up secrets that had been buried under the long winter's snow. Harold had been increasingly agitated since February, pacing the house at odd hours and spending whole days locked in his workroom without emerging even for meals. And I could feel something building toward a breaking point that terrified me more than his previous predictable routines had ever done. Dr. Patterson had been true to his word about investigating my concerns, though he'd been careful never to speak to me directly about what he'd discovered, communicating instead through subtle nods when we passed on the street, or meaningful looks during Sunday services that let me know he was taking my accusations seriously. I'd seen him having quiet conversations with Sheriff Morrison after church, seen him making notes in a small leather journal that he kept close to his chest, And I knew he was building a case against Harold, piece by careful piece, the way a hunter sets snares in the woods. But Harold was no ordinary prey, and I should have realized that a man who'd been hiding his true nature for over 40 years would have developed instincts about when he was being watched, when questions were being asked that came too close to dangerous truths. I first noticed the change in him on a Thursday morning in early April, when he came upstairs from his workroom, with a look in his gray eyes that I'd never seen before. Not the usual cold calculation or clinical detachment, but something wild and desperate that made him look almost human, for the first time since I'd known him. He sat across from me at the breakfast table that morning, studying my face with an intensity that made my hands shake as I tried to butter my toast. And when he finally spoke, his voice had a sharp edge to it that cut through the usual calm politeness of our conversations. He told me that people in town had been asking questions about his work, expressing concerns about missing items and unusual circumstances surrounding certain deaths, and he wanted to know if I had any idea why, suddenly, everyone seemed so interested in his business. The way he asked the question made it clear he already knew the answer, or at least suspected it, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to keep my voice steady and my expression innocent. I told him I couldn't imagine why anyone would question his professional conduct, that he'd always been nothing but respected and admired by everyone in the community. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew he could hear the lie in them, could see the guilt written across my face like words in a book he'd learned to read too well. Harold leaned back in his chair and smiled that thin, cold smile of his. But there was something different about it this time. Something that reminded me of a snake coiling before it strikes. And he told me how much he appreciated my loyalty over the years, how grateful he was to have a wife who understood the importance of keeping family secrets safe from prying eyes. But then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he reminded me of what would happen to both of us if anyone ever discovered the truth about our marriage, about the things I'd seen and kept silent about the complicity that made me just as guilty as he was in the eyes of the law. That afternoon, while Harold was meeting with the Morrison family about arrangements for their father's funeral, Dr. Patterson appeared at my kitchen door looking more serious than I'd ever seen him, his face drawn with the weight of whatever he'd discovered during his investigation. He told me that he'd found evidence supporting my concerns about Harold's conduct, that there were too many unexplained disappearances and suspicious deaths connected to the funeral parlor for it to be mere coincidence, and that he was planning to take his findings to the state authorities within the week. But he also warned me that I was in terrible danger, that Harold was the kind of man who would do anything to protect himself when he felt cornered, and that I needed to leave town immediately, that very night, if possible, before Harold realized how much the investigation had uncovered. Dr. Patterson had already made arrangements for me to stay with his sister in Lexington until the authorities could arrest Harold and ensure my safety. But he made it clear that time was running short and that Harold's growing desperation made him more dangerous than ever. I spent that evening packing a small bag with my few precious possessions, hiding it under the bed where Harold wouldn't think to look, and trying to prepare myself mentally for what would happen when the truth finally came to light, when the whole community learned what kind of monster had been living among them all these years. But I also found myself thinking about all the victims Harold had claimed, all the innocent people who died to satisfy his sick hunger for control and companionship. And I knew that their families deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The plan was for me to slip out of the house sometime after midnight, when Harold would be deep in his work, and unlikely to notice my absence until morning. But Harold's behavior that evening suggested he suspected something was about to happen. He kept finding excuses to check on me, appearing in doorways when I least expected him. watching me with those predatory eyes as I tried to act normal while my nerves screamed with tension and fear. Around 11 o'clock, Harold announced that he had some special work to do in the basement and that I shouldn't wait up for him. But there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, something that suggested his special work might involve more than just the usual corpse he'd been preparing for burial. As he headed downstairs to his workroom, I heard him humming under his breath, one of those hymns he liked to sing to his dead companions, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever he was planning to do down there, I didn't want to be in the house when he did it. I waited until I heard the familiar sounds of Harold moving around in his workroom, the clink of metal instruments, and the splash of chemicals, and then I grabbed my hidden bag and crept toward the kitchen door, moving as silently as I could through the dark house that had been my prison for so many months. But just as I reached for the door handle, just as freedom seemed within my grasp, I heard Harold's voice calling my name from the basement, and the tone of it made my blood freeze because it wasn't the usual calm, controlled voice I was used to. It was something raw and desperate and completely unhinged. He called my name again, louder this time, and I could hear his footsteps on the basement stairs, moving faster than I'd ever heard him move before. And I knew that he'd discovered my plan somehow, that all his instincts about being hunted had finally focused on me as the source of his danger. I had maybe 30 seconds before he reached the kitchen. 30 seconds to decide whether to run for the door and hope I could reach Dr. Patterson's house before Harold caught me, or to face whatever confrontation was coming and pray that I'd survive it. And as those footsteps grew closer, as Harold's voice grew more frantic and demanding, I realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward since that awful night when I'd first discovered his secrets. The moment when all the lies and silence and terror would finally explode into the open, and whatever happened next would determine whether I lived to see another sunrise or joined the ranks of Harold's silent companions in their eternal chemical sleep. I ran. Lord help me. I ran like the devil himself was chasing me, which maybe he was, bursting through that kitchen door into the cold April night, with Harold's voice echoing behind me like something out of a nightmare. My bare feet hit the wet grass, and I kept running, clutching that little bag to my chest and not daring to look back, because I could hear Harold behind me, his heavy breathing and the sound of his shoes slapping against the ground as he gave chase through the darkness that had hidden so many of his secrets for so many years. But I knew these streets better than Harold did, knew every shortcut and alley from my childhood visits to town, and somehow I managed to stay ahead of him long enough to reach Dr. Patterson's house, pounding on his door with both fists, until he appeared in his nightclothes, took one look at my terrified face, and pulled me inside without asking any questions. Harold must have seen where I went, because within minutes he was at Dr. Patterson's door too, demanding that his wife be returned to him, speaking in that calm, controlled voice that made him sound so reasonable, even while his eyes held the wild look of a trapped animal. Dr. Patterson stood firm against Harold's demands, telling him that I was under his protection now, and that the authorities had already been notified about the investigation into his activities at the funeral parlor. The look that crossed Harold's face when he heard those words was something I'll never forget. Like watching a mask slip away to reveal the true monster underneath. All the years of careful pretense falling away in an instant to show the sick, twisted thing he'd always been. What happened next unfolded so quickly that it still feels like a dream sometimes, or maybe a nightmare that I never quite woke up from. Harold tried to force his way into Dr. Patterson's house, and in the struggle that followed, Dr. Patterson's hunting rifle went off, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood like thunder on a clear night. Harold collapsed on the front porch, blood spreading across his white shirt, and the last words he spoke were about how I belonged to him, how I'd never be free of what I knew, how his secrets would follow me to my grave. The state investigators arrived the next morning and spent 3 days going through Harold's funeral parlor with fine-tooth combs, uncovering evidence of crimes that were even worse than I'd imagined possible. They found the room with the glass jars, found Harold's detailed journals documenting his experiments on the dead, found items belonging to at least 7 people who'd supposedly died of natural causes or accidents, but had really been murdered to satisfy Harold's sick need for perfect silent companions. The hardest part was facing the families of Harold's victims, looking into their eyes as they learned the truth about what had happened to their loved ones, seeing their grief turn to horror as they realized that the man they'd trusted with their most precious farewells had been violating and desecrating those bodies in ways that defied every decent human instinct. Some of them blamed me for not speaking up sooner. And maybe they were right. Maybe I could have saved some of those lives if I'd found my courage earlier, but I was just a frightened girl in a world that didn't much care what women thought or felt about anything. I left Kentucky that spring and never went back, changing my name and starting over in places where nobody knew about Harold Davis or his young wife who'd escaped from that house of horrors. I worked as a seamstress and a cleaning lady, honest jobs that let me sleep at night without nightmares about glass jars and chemical smells. And slowly, year by year, I built myself a new life on the foundation of the courage I'd finally found in that terrible moment when running was the only choice left to me. But the real surprise, the twist that nobody could have seen coming, didn't reveal itself until 20 years later, when I was living in Ohio under my new name and thought I'd finally put the past behind me. That's when I got a letter from a lawyer in Kentucky telling me that Harold's house and funeral parlor had been sold after sitting empty for 2 decades, and that during the renovation, workers had made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about Harold's crimes. They found another room, hidden behind a false wall in the basement, and in that room were the bodies of Harold's real victims. Not the people from town whose deaths we'd investigated, but women who disappeared from other places, other states. Women who'd been kept alive in that secret room for weeks or months, while Harold performed his twisted experiments on them before they died. And there, among those poor souls, was evidence that Harold hadn't been working alone, that there had been others involved in his operation, people who'd helped him acquire his victims and dispose of the evidence. The letter explained that one of Harold's accomplices was still alive, still living free somewhere, and that the authorities were reopening the case with new evidence that might finally bring some justice for all the families who'd never learned what happened to their missing daughters and sisters. And sitting in my little kitchen in Ohio, reading those words by lamplight, I realized that my escape from Harold's house hadn't been the end of the story after all, but just the end of the first chapter in a tale of evil that was bigger and more complicated than anyone had imagined. I'm telling you this story now, at 79 years old, because that accomplice was never found, because somewhere out there might be someone else carrying secrets, like the ones I carried for so long, someone who needs to hear that it's possible to survive, possible to speak up, possible to start over, even when it seems like the darkness has swallowed up everything good in the world. I learned that courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you find when you finally get tired of being afraid, when the weight of silence becomes heavier than the risk of speaking truth. Harold's physical abnormality was just the beginning of his strangeness, the first secret that led to all the others. And maybe if I'd understood then what I know now about how evil grows and spreads when good people stay quiet, I might have acted sooner, might have saved some of those lives that were lost, because I was too scared and too young to know my own strength. But I survived, And that survival is its own kind of victory. Proof that even when you think you're trapped forever, even when the walls seem too high and the darkness seems too deep, there's always a door somewhere, if you're brave enough to look for it. And if my story can help just one person find their door, if it can give just one frightened soul the courage to run when running is the only choice left, then maybe all those years of carrying Harold's secrets weren't completely in vain. I'm still here, still standing after all these decades. And I want you to know that whatever darkness you might be facing, whatever secrets might be crushing your spirit, you're stronger than you think you are, and your voice matters more than you know. If my words have touched something in your heart, if they've helped you understand that survival is possible even in the deepest night, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because every voice that speaks up against evil makes the world a little brighter, a little safer, a little more hopeful. And tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my words are traveling, how far this old woman's voice can reach across the years and miles. If you've stayed with me through this whole long tale, if you've found something worth keeping in these memories, I've finally had the courage to share, then maybe you could help my story find its way to other hearts that need to hear it, because that's how healing happens. One voice at a time, one truth at a time, one act of courage that inspires another. Subscribe to hear more stories from women like me, women who survived things they never thought they could survive, because our voices matter, our experiences matter, and together we can make sure that no one has to carry such terrible secrets alone ever again.